Hello, today I would like to introduce you to someone who has excelled in life. He is a linguist, novelist, and short story writer, philosopher, and professor. Dr. Harold C. Raley holds degrees in multiple subjects, including a bachelor's in English, a master's in foreign languages, and doctorates in humanities and philosophy. Named Distinguished Professor, he has taught languages, literature, and philosophy in American and foreign universities. His publications include 14 books of fiction, history, language, and philosophy, and approximately 150 articles and essays on wide ranging topics in professional journals and newspapers. Now, here is Dr. Harold Raley to talk to you about José Ortega de Gasset, who was a Spanish philosopher and head of the Madrid School of Philosophy.
Hello, I'm Professor Harold Raley, and I'd like to talk to you some about the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset. My rationale for doing so is that even though there are several very good videos about Ortega, they're all in Spanish, they're excellent, but there's nothing that I know of in English. And Ortega is a very important thinker, and I think ought to be more widely known in this country. So that's the rationale we're talking about. Ortega was born in Madrid in 1883 in May and died in Madrid October 18, 1955. And in between, he did some very remarkable things, wrote some very remarkable books. I sometimes call him the Midas philosopher because everything he turned to was genius, whether history, politics, metaphysics, you name it, art, the novel. He did it so well. Whatever he turned his hand to, he was a genius, to put it briefly. He did his studies, he got his doctorate from the University of Madrid in 1904. And not long after, on a fellowship, he went to Germany and studied for a little less than 2 years, came back. 2 or 3 years later, he won the chair of metaphysics at the University of Madrid. And then he left again after marrying. He left again for Germany with his wife. And later on, a son was born up there. And he became the father of 3 children. He studied under illustrious professors. In those days, as you probably know, Germany was the foremost country in science and certainly in philosophy. So it was the place to go. There was no strong philosophical tradition in Spain, and I'll come back to that in a kind of an odd way, perhaps later on in these comments. In Germany, he studied neo-Kantianism under his first professors there. He was not very happy with that. He came away from Germany saying that he found everything that he wanted in Germany, great professors, a great tradition, fine facilities. The only thing he didn't find was a philosophy that he thought was proper for the 20th century. He went back, and the second time he came into contact in particular with Edmund Husserl and the philosophy of phenomenology. Ortega was interested, he was taken by phenomenology, and in fact, he took the method, but not the conclusions of Husserl. He did what later on would be called a tactical turn or an inflection. To put it in plain language, he went off in a different direction in what he thought was a more fertile way of philosophizing. Returning to Spain in 1912, he assumed his duties as professor of metaphysics. Metaphysics, by the way, to put it briefly, is simply a theory of reality, how reality is structured, what its basic features are. Because metaphysics, as you probably know, has other meanings of mysticism and other associations that are not really what metaphysics mean. It goes back to Aristotle, and it simply means those truths that are beyond the obvious, the structure, in other words, of reality. That's metaphysics, beyond the physical, beyond the obvious. So back in Spain, he quickly became well known as a writer, and in 1914, he published his first really major book outlining his new philosophy. His book called, in English, Meditations on Quixote. Quixote, Don Quixote, the famous figure created by Cervantes. And in this book, he attacked the problem that had been inherent in idealistic philosophy, that is, the philosophy of the mind that goes back to Descartes. Descartes had one certainty, and most of us have heard what it is. I think, therefore I am. And on that basis of that one certainty, he created and began the philosophy of what we call idealism, which simply means centering reality in the mind, in the consciousness of reality, the awareness of it. This passed on through several thinkers, Leibniz, Kant himself, down to Husserl. Ortegas had meditated quite a bit on this, and he said, Descartes was wrong. There are three certainties. One, I think, therefore I am. That's true, as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far. The next certainty is that thinking is not possible unless you think about things. You think about people, you think about associations, events, objects. And so if there are objects and people and events, then obviously they have to be somewhere. And that somewhere is the world. It's the circumstances that we live in. So those are the three certainties that Ortegas began with: the mind, the world, and my thinking about the world, my circumstance. On this basis, he said that the primary reality is not my awareness of things. The awareness of things cannot be things in themselves. That would be like double dipping, a tautology. What I really find is that I find myself doing things with all these objects, events, people, happenings that take place in the world. So the world, the things, and my thinking, my activity with those things, the three realities that I mentioned, means that I am living with these things. And here we come to the foundational reality in Ortega, and that is what I really do with things. I think about them, but I do something much more basic, and that is I live with them. I live by means of them. So my life then becomes the foundational reality in which I encounter things, everything, from the very tiniest to the largest. I find in it things that are possible. I find in things that are impossible. All that and much more is part of my circumstance, including my physical body. It's part of my circumstance. It's what I find myself involved with. And the involvement is the desire to go on living, the struggle to live and not to die. It's the human condition. And the search is always, of course, for happiness, fulfillment, which is to be all the person that I can be. And that is the principle of happiness, to be who we intend to be and hope to be and work to be. So my life is the foundational reality. Ortega said it is the radical reality. And by this he means the Latin meaning of the word radical, which means root. Everything is rooted in my life. The cosmos. Nowadays we talk about how vast the cosmos is, the universe. Well, it's true. But in a sense, the universe is also in us. We encounter it as we live. We gain knowledge about it. We use it. We create science. We speculate. We write poems and love songs about the moon and the stars and things of that nature. So my emotional life is also involved. So that's the basic metaphysics that Ortega came up with. Now in Germany, as I said, Husserl had a great impact, and so did Scheler, another great thinker. And even the neo-Kantian thinkers had their influence, but it was mostly what philosophy could not be. And that sometimes is as important as what things that cannot be clear the way for things that are. So it's important to discover what, in terms of philosophy, what it is and what it isn't. So there was another influence, very important. In Germany, Ortega came across a man named Dilthey, Wilhelm Dilthey, who was a historian primarily. Dilthey had an intuition. He had read, of course, the works of Hegel, the great historian and philosopher. Hegel said the purpose of reason is to inject it into history. One reason, one purpose is to apply it to history. Well, Dilthey had another intuition that there was something much deeper than that involved in history. But he could never bring it into doctrinal form. He struggled with the intuition for like 30 years and was unable to, he wrote some books, and Ortega thought they were important enough to be translated. He had them translated. And probably the first time that Dilthey was known outside of Germany was in Spain and in the Spanish language. And Ortega had that book translated and made available to the reading public in his own country. By the way, Ortega spoke German, and later on we'll see how appreciated he was in Germany, where he was accounted almost as one of them. And no wonder, because as Ortega said, I learned 4/5 of all my philosophy in German. So he was always very grateful to his German professors and mentors. Ortega took Dilthey's intuition a step further. He said simply, and Ortega had a way of cutting through to the bare bones. He could take complex ideas and express them in beautiful lyrical language. If you know Spanish and you haven't read Ortega, you haven't read the best Spanish. If you don't know Spanish and want to learn it, there's no better place to go than to learn to read Ortega. He is a master of the language. It's been said that he is the greatest writer in Spanish since Cervantes. That's saying a lot. That would be like saying that someone is as good as Shakespeare in the English-speaking world. Well, he is a masterful writer. I can testify to that. At the time I discovered Ortega, way back in the early 60s, I was teaching French at that time, a language I loved and had spent a lot of time learning, and had gotten advanced degrees in the language. And and really was thinking about doing my dissertation probably on some member of the Enlightenment, which always enlightened me and delighted me. And I still read my French writers with great enthusiasm and with a chuckle now and then. I've often said that the Enlightenment was the last time philosophers had fun and enjoyed what they were doing. In the 19th century, most philosophers became heavily Teutonic, serious, ponderous, very hard to read, massive tomes. Ortega cut through all that. His books are short and to the point. What I was about to say about his what he did with the intuition that Dilthey had, he said, man does not have a nature. We talk about human nature. There is no such thing. What man has is a history, and it's the history that determines many things, like the language we speak. We inherited it. We didn't invent English or Spanish or French. It was here when we got here. So we learn that. We learn our customs, our basic beliefs from our history. It's the reason why we are as we are, primarily. We can't just go out and recreate ourselves. That's a fallacy of modern fiction. Go out and find yourself. Sometimes it's best not to. And sometimes there's not much to find unless you work at creating yourself, making your life, doing what Ortega said, living in your circumstances, mastering it. Anyway, he said, history, the question is not to insert reason into history, rationalism into history, but to accept history as reason. It's the reason why things are as they are. It's the real reason. It's far deeper than rationalism, far deeper than reason with a capital R. Reason is the way we do things every day, the way we speak, the way we think, the assumptions, the customs, the prohibitions, very important, the taboos, the things we can't do in our culture. And this is a part of life that can be altered, can be changed. But Ortega said this is the foundational form of reason, historical reason. He used that term. And he also said in that same context that in order to understand anything human, we have to tell a story. And we have to narrate something. So reason, in this sense, is also narrative reason, the telling of reality. Things are not really true until we can say them. And this is where Ortega got to. And he got to it very quickly and very snappily. When someone says, we don't have a nature, we have a history, that gets your attention because we have always assumed the human nature. Well, we have certain appetites and things, but we're not like animals. We don't live by instincts. We don't live by Mother Nature. Or if we do, we're less than human. We make our way. We invent our way. We deal with our circumstance. Out of this, he developed what the philosophers call a cogito, which is simply a motto. As I said, Descartes' motto was, I think, therefore I am. Ortega's motto was a little bit different. He said, I am I and my circumstance, this involvement with the world. And then he went on to say, if I do not save it, I do not save myself. So we're a part of that world. We don't stand apart from our circumstance. We make our life within our circumstance, from it. And we resolve conflicts. A culture is a bundle of inherited problems and solutions. It's the way we deal with things. We have an American way of dealing with things. Sometimes not very good, sometimes excellent. Other countries have their ways of dealing with problems. So we are we in our circumstance. I am I in my circumstance. So this book created quite a stir, and for another reason, it was beautifully written. It reads almost like poetry. It's lyrical. The farthest thing you can imagine from the heavy-handed philosophy of the 19th century. It's short, it's beautiful, and it does things that we're not accustomed to. For example, it goes beyond objective reality. Objective reality is that which is seen from nowhere and by nobody. Supposedly it's the same for everybody. But the truth is that we see all reality from our life, from my life, the life of each person. So perspective in this brilliant work of Ortega's becomes a part of reality. You have surface, you have depth, you have things at a distance. And you discover, if you analyze it, that I am the one who puts things at a distance or considers them near at hand. Perspective becomes a part of reality. That's a little hard to get past objective reality. But reality seen from nowhere and by nobody is not, it's a fiction, because that really doesn't happen. It has a certain limited applicability in, say, science, but you very soon reach the limits of it. Ortega at the same time was waging a war against what he called bourgeois realism, the other philosophy. Philosophy had always alternated between idealism and realism. And he said, the problem with realistic philosophy is that it avoids the major questions. You can't solve a question or can't resolve it, then you simply ignore it. For example, what happens when we die? Well, the modern philosophers, late 19th, 20th century, many of them, and you could name them, Bertrand Russell, for example, any number of Sartre, for example, in France. You can't solve that problem, so they say. And they decide that before they've even looked at the problem. And so what happens? You don't treat it. You give up on the question. And Ortega said, philosophy is not known for its answers. It's known for its questions. The questions are more important than the answers, because the answers are not definitive, but the questions are defining. They made a good point there, I thought. Now, in Spain, he quickly became the leader of the intelligentsia in Spanish. Marvelous writer, even better as a speaker, maybe. He could mesmerize an audience for an hour, even 2 hours. This included his classes. I have read accounts of his students. And they would sit there sometimes for an hour, sometimes 2, and even approaching 3. And there was not a sound in the room, except maybe a pencil writing a few notes down. He was that good. And he could do the same with great public audiences. He went to Argentina and spoke before massive crowds in Buenos Aires. Then he crossed over on one of his visits to Chile and spoke to as many as 4,000 people. He probably lectured to more people than any philosopher that I know of in modern times. I don't know of anybody that can approach those kind of numbers. So he continued to write important books. In 1921, he wrote a book called Invertebrate Spain. I'm giving the English titles to these. That was the idea that there are things wrong with Spain. Have always been wrong. Things that were from the very beginning of that nation that were not constituted in the best way in comparison to France. Ortega admired France, thought it was the prototypical European nation. He spoke French, of course. He knew practically all. He knew some English quite a bit. He translated English and apparently spoke it I don't know how well. German, I mentioned, Latin, Greek. Those were languages, classical and modern, that you needed if you were going to be a bona fide philosopher in those times. So this book, even though some people, including some of his closest followers, objected to it, but nevertheless, it was a well publicized and a book that sold very well. He was also gifted in the arts. By that I mean the criticism, the principles of art. He wrote a book called The Dehumanization of Art. And you've seen that in modern art with the Picassos and the people of that school, where over the ages, in progressive stages, the human figure disappeared, at least the figure that we think of as a real human, and not with both eyes on one side of the face and the nose kind of pushed over to one side. That's the progressive dehumanization of art. And Ortega explained it better than anybody I know of. He also wrote another work called Ideas on the Novel, and those were published as one volume, and they also were bestsellers. He had founded in 1916 a publication called The Spectator. And The Spectator consisted of articles that Ortega wrote himself over a period of 18 years, till 1934. I believe my arithmetic is right. And his public loved it. These were brilliant insights into things. Ortega loved to travel the back country, explore the small towns, and he discovered things that were just absolutely gorgeous and described them in this beautiful language of his and mesmerized his public. And he wrote other books too. In 1929, we'll skip over a couple of things. He wrote his best book, his most popular book, called The Revolt of the Masses, La Rebelión de las Masas in Spanish, and it was translated as The Revolt of the Masses. He had also published another book called, somewhat similar, kind of a preface, called The Theme of Our Time. Unfortunately, it got a title in English that was inappropriate, the translators. There were some bad translations of Ortega. And Ortega, you can barely translate him because he's too good. He's like Heidegger in German. Nobody can translate Heidegger. Many have tried. Even the Germans sometimes can't understand him. I've been told that German students will buy the English translation to read Heidegger to try to understand what he's saying. I've read some in German, a good bit, matter of fact. And it's a workout. It's mental gymnastics. It will, I remember once reading a paragraph, and in 6 lines, I believe it is, he mentions the word sein, being, 9 times. I want to think, unless I've exaggerated, but many number. And each one with a certain meaning. And if you lose the meaning of one, you lose the entire sequence of thought in that lengthy paragraph. So Ortega is difficult to translate for another reason, because his language is so lyrical. And it doesn't come across in English. It takes a great translator to translate Ortega. I've translated quite a bit. Not Ortega, a few things of Ortega's, but I'm too wise to tackle him head on. It would take a matching genius, really, to put his thoughts into English as craftily and as artistically as he does. Anyway, The Revolt of the Masses became a runaway bestseller, not only in Spain, but all over the world. It was translated into I don't know how many languages, and established Ortega as a major thinker, not only in Europe, but in this country back in the late 20s and early 30s. That book is worth reading. As a matter of fact, it was the first book that I picked up and read. I had delayed reading it because I thought the title sounded like a Marxist work, and I was not into workers' paradises in those days. I bought the book in Mexico City. I put it on the books to read because it was on my list of things. By that time, I was advanced to the doctoral level, more or less. And I was going to devour the book. And I said in a recent preface, the book devoured me instead. I was astonished. And my respect and appreciation of the Spanish language rose several degrees when I read that book. It is gorgeous, but it's serious too. He goes through, he cleans away the cliches and platitudes and describes what's going on in the world, and it's applicable today. If you read that book today, you would think it must have been written last week, because it talks about the masked man. The specialist, one aspect, and I'll just mention this in passing, is the specialist. The guy who knows, or the gal who knows one specialty, maybe very, very narrow in the sciences or whatever it is, as a major ball player, but they have a great skill, they have a great talent in that one area. And then from that, they extrapolate that and pass judgment on everything. And it's especially true, if you'll notice, in the propaganda world and the advertising world. A gifted athlete will tell you that you should buy brand X, maybe a car or some product about which they know nothing, but they have a famous name. So from one field, you get an application in a different field, which is totally fallacious. These people don't know anything about what they're talking about. It doesn't matter. We know them. They're famous in that particular area. So this book became, as I said, a runaway bestseller and established Ortega, along with Spengler and others who had written about the collapse of Western civilization. Spengler's famous for his book on the Untergang of the West, the fall of the West, I've forgotten what it's called in English, but it's the idea that Western civilization has entered into decline. Ortega, in the book that I mentioned earlier, The Theme of Our Time, it was translated in English as the modern theme. Unfortunate, as I repeat, because the very thing that Ortega talked about was that modernity has ended. The modern age has ended. Now, 100 years later, almost, we're talking about the postmodern world. Well, the postmodern movement began back in the 1920s in Europe under the Germans and under Ortega. And it's just now coming into full flower in America. So a lot of things that were prophesied, Ortega talked about the formation of the European Union, and it happened pretty much the way he predicted. His predictions are sometimes uncanny, his insight. You would think the man is almost psychic, but he says, no, it's not that. It's simply analyzing the trends of history, and if you understand them completely, you know which way the world is going. And one thing he said that really startled me was that mankind is becoming progressively less intelligent. And there's a sort of a wave movement in human affairs. During the Enlightenment, there was kind of a burst of genius. And then you have the valleys where people seem to lose their insight. So that was his most famous work. But at the same time, he did something that is both great and unfortunate, and I'll explain why. he gave a series of 11 lectures. He contracted to do them. And just as he was about to begin, the universities were closed. At that time, Spain was being managed by a military dictatorship, Primo de Rivera, and he closed the universities. The universities were hotbeds of sedition, intrigue, unrest, protest. So what else is new? We've seen that it happened later, but it happened in this country too. Anyway, universities were closed, but Ortega went ahead and gave his lectures outside the university, rented a theater, a small one at first, or a smaller one, but the crowds were so huge he had to go to a major theater in Madrid. And the crowds kept increasing with each lecture, 11. At the end of the thing, he had more than he started with by far. And he tells what philosophy is as he understands it. Goes through the history, the progressions. The problem was, and this is the unfortunate part, those works were never published in his lifetime. The people that attended the lectures and heard him, these were not professional philosophers for the most part. There were some. They were dilettantes. They were amateurs. They were the general public, but they loved what he was saying because he was a masterful speaker. He could hypnotize you with his words, his verbal magic. But he explains his system. He had been criticized for not having a system, a philosophical system, which was de rigueur, as the French would say. It was necessary according to the old 19th century idea of philosophy in the German mode. You have to have a meticulous editorial system. Ortega said life is the system, history is the system, human history. And anything you add beyond that is just editorial addendum. But in this particular series of lectures, he does explain, and he does go into what his idea of system is and how he came to think the way he thought. Later, those were published 3 years after his death, along with many other works that were published over a period of at least 14 years after he died. He had written a lot of stuff that never got published. And much of what he wrote, really important works, were never translated. There's a translation is not a science that is very profitable, let's say, for a scholar. It's better to write one little article with a few footnotes than to translate a book, which requires a great deal more talent and time. It's unfortunate because so many great works are not available, especially in our country, because we think we have what I call the provincialism of the powerful. We think that anything that's worthwhile is probably already here in this country. Not necessarily. There's a lot in art, literature, perhaps even music, which I know little about, philosophy certainly, that is not available to the American reader. We need to have a school of, if I can preach just a second, a school of translators to make all this stuff available to American readers, to English-speaking readers. So in 1931, the monarchy fell. Alphonse XIII abdicated and followed Primo de Rivera to Paris. They both left the country, and Spain had its second republic. They'd had the first one back in around 1870, didn't last very long, and so they had their second. They're a little bit behind the French. I think the French are in their fourth or fifth republic. Still haven't found the right formula for it, apparently, from what's going on over there now. But during the 5 years that the Republic existed, that was the golden age of philosophy, of the universities, of investigation and research. Spain came of age intellectually during that time under the leadership of Ortega. Ortega, the master metaphysician at the University of Madrid, and around him formed the school, what's called the Madrid School of Philosophy. Many philosophers, but others who were specialists or experts in other fields like medicine, psychology, psychiatry, the arts, history particularly. So it was a golden age. But 1936, the Republic had drifted far to the left and the Marxists were infiltrating and it looked like they might take over. So General Franco had the obligation, so he thought, to get rid of all this and to defeat the Marxists before they got a foothold in Spain. So he came over from Africa. Spain had a territory over there in Africa at that time. Led a revolt and eventually won the war. It was a bitter war, bitterly fought. The Germans came down from Germany to help Franco. The Marxists came from Russia to help, and the Americans, we kind of sided with the Marxists at that time. And there was a terrific struggle that had international implications. Franco won in 1939. But in 1936, Ortega went into exile for 10 years, almost 10 years, until late 1945. He went to Paris first. Paris was always the place anybody went if they were exiled first. He lived there a year or so and then went to Argentina, where he was greatly respected and remembered. Lived there for 2 or 3 years and then came back to the Iberian Peninsula and took up residence in Portugal for the remaining years. He got as close to Spain as he could without crossing over into Spain. So in 1945, as I said, he came back, still revered, but did not resume his teaching position, did not go into politics because at one time he was elected a delegate to the Spanish Parliament. Equivalent would be to us or to the British, and was well known for his political commentary. Always had an interest in politics, in the arts, history, just about anything. As I said, he was the Midas guy. Anything he touched turned to gold, even though it didn't please a lot of people. He had some bitter enemies, and he was attacked viciously in those last years, the last 10 years of his life, by the right, by the left, by the church, to a certain degree, at least some of the reactionary elements in the church. But they didn't know where Ortega stood religiously. And Ortega never tipped his hand, except to say near the end of his life that he had always been in God's hands. And if you take the sum of what he wrote, which was not very much because he stayed away from religion, because the other great Spanish thinker of that time was Unamuno, and he wrote just about exclusively about the fate of mortal men, mortal people, what happens to you. And so Ortega stayed clear of that. He had respect for Unamuno. They had once been friends and were always cordial, even though Ortega ended up being more famous than Unamuno. In 1949, I should mention though before, in 1948, he and Julian Marias, his major disciple and successor in this philosophy and this metaphysics that he created, had founded the Institute of Humanities, which ran for only 3 years, but it turned out some really impressive work, like the theory of generations. That was another thing that Ortega seemed to invent. The idea of the generation in a specific way. And it's fascinating if you apply it to history. I have tried it, and my surprise, it seems to work. He was also responsible, and I failed to mention this, for what's called the Ortega hypothesis. And one of the main aspects of the Ortega hypothesis is that inventions in modern times are not the work of a single person. For example, Leonardo da Vinci, for example, as a single genius, could dream up all kinds of things. In modern times, it's more like a team, and that's the idea of the Ortega hypothesis. It's teamwork. It takes a bunch of specialists. It's kind of a sidebar uh, to the mass man theory that he developed in his great book. Anyway, they closed down over Marius's objections. The Institute in 1950, and a few months earlier than that, Ortega had returned to Germany. He hadn't been in Germany for many years, but it was an event. The Germans thought of Ortega almost as one of them. He spoke the language, he knew the culture, and he lectured, and people trampled each other trying to get to hear him. And you can guess what the reporters called the event: the revolt of the masses. Some German wit. It was well done. It was fitting because people were so anxious to hear Ortega, and he lectured. In fact, he lectured several times before the end of his life in Germany. He also lectured in England. He had been offered a job at Harvard University in 1937, a major position, but he didn't take it because his health was somewhat delicate in those years, and he did suffer from bouts of illness on and off for the rest of his life. But he did the lectures. He continued to write. Many of those, as I mentioned before, were never published. Most have not been translated, but they're major writers. For example, he did a work on Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, which is a masterful interpretation of Toynbee's theories. Deserves to be out there, but it is. It's in Spanish. It's in his collected works, but it hasn't been translated as far as I know. It still doesn't exist in English even, not even for the English-speaking world. So in October 18, 1955, Ortega died at his home in Madrid. I never met Ortega except through his works, and that is a way to know somebody, sometimes the best way. I do remember, unless my memory has failed me, the day he died, I was in a French class, and my dear old French professor, who had an appreciation of Spanish culture, he'd been in Spain, he actually taught Spanish at times. I believe my first class in Spanish was later, not that, this was a French class, and one of my advanced French classes. Dr. Matthews came in and he said, I am sorry to inform you that today in Madrid, the eminent Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset has died. And I didn't know an Ortega from an acorn in those days, and I thought, who or what is an Ortega? In later years, and for almost the rest of my life, I have been involved in discovering who Ortega is and was and continues to be. So thank you very much.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation brought to you by Total Recall Press. You can find Dr. Harold Raley's book at totalrecallpress.com, Amazon, Kindle, and Nook.